Welcome everybody to part 2 in a lecture series on American religion now. If you came to the first lecture, I guess you may have left that feeling a little bit depressed about the state of religion, certainly in America. We looked at a couple of things. Number one, we looked at these trends which show that religion, almost in every denomination, certainly in every mainline denomination, has been steadily declining since the mid-60s. So the PCUSA, for example, hit its apex in the mid-60s. We had, I think it was around 4 million members. And right now we have about 1 million members. So significant drop year after year. And we also looked last time at the fact that underneath these demographic shifts, there may be some deeper philosophical changes in the Western mind. So I shared some information from Charles Taylor, the philosopher, who I think is something, he's somebody that a lot of church leaders should read, because he talks about the fact that it's not just that we've moved from believing in God to not believing in God, it's that our whole worldview, in terms of what we think of as reality, has really shifted to a much more secular worldview. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today, and the title of my talk is Rediscovering an Enchanted Cosmos, because Taylor's point is that the way we look at the world now is in a very disenchanted way. So whereas our medieval ancestors really did think that the world was filled with spirits, and they could affect us in both good and bad ways, now we view ourselves as very kind of atomized, private individuals that are walled off. If we even believe in spiritual realities at all, which many people don't, even if they do exist, we're very protected from them. So let's begin by talking. I think it's important to point out that although this talk is mainly about Europe and America, the West, we are seeing an explosion of Christianity in the global South. And Christianity is growing so much in the global South that it is more than making up for the losses in Europe and America. So if you look at the distribution of Christians in the year 1900, 82% of them were in Europe and North America, and only 18% were in the global South, meaning Latin America, Africa, and China. Look at how this is completely reversed. Now only 33% of world Christians live in the West, and 67% live in these developing nations. And if you look specifically at Africa, there's another thing that's very interesting. Christianity in Africa really didn't take off until 1970. Now, what's interesting about that? That was after all the colonial powers had left Africa. That is when Christianity began to explode in Africa. When the European colonial powers left, and African nations began, they had won their independence. And so it really, I think, brings into question this idea that some people have that Christianity is this white Western imposition on indigenous populations. Turns out, once the Europeans left Africa, that was really when Christianity began to explode on the continent. Now, another thing that I wanted to point out is, looking at world Christianity, that Christianity tends to grow, ironically, precisely in those places where it's persecuted. So if I asked you, as a percentage of the population, where Christianity is growing the fastest, does anybody have any idea? That's a good guess. It's actually Iran. In Iran, it is so persecuted that people have to meet in private, in secret, in people's homes. It is illegal, since the Islamic Revolution, it's been illegal to own a Bible that is translated into Farsi. And yet, as a percentage of the population, Christianity is growing in Iran faster than anywhere else on earth. It has grown a lot in China. It has gone, I think I have the numbers here, in China, when Mao took over in 1949, there were only 700,000 Christians in China. Today, there are, let's go back, it doesn't show you the breakout of China, but there are over 100 million. And that growth took place precisely in communism, when it was dangerous to practice your Christian faith. I think that's an interesting idea to note, and I think it's in keeping with the early Christians. Of course, If you look at the early church and how persecuted Christianity was, it exploded in the midst of that persecution. So it went from being just the tiniest minority to, within less than 300 years, becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire, which is astonishing. Now we're going to go back to the West and pick up where we left off last time. And I talked about the fact that 30 years ago, the received wisdom, kind of the accepted wisdom in the West was religion's dying, and there's probably nothing we can do about it. And my talk last time might have even given some weight to that idea, because we looked at declining church attendance, and some of that, some people think, could be, you could give credit to these guys. So in the 90s, these four men were called the four horsemen of the new apocalypse, the atheist apocalypse. Richard Dawkins, the evolutionary biologist, the late Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, and Daniel Dennett, who's also no longer with us. Each of these guys was a very public sort of polemicist for atheism, wrote books, went on speaking tours. They were very popular, and it seemed for a while that new atheism was on the rise. But that's not what happened. If you look actually at what's happened over the last 20 years, the blue numbers here are atheists in America. In 2015, about 6% of the population identified as atheist. And last year, about 6% of the population identified as atheists. So the sort of population of atheists in America really hasn't changed very much to the chagrin of these guys. What has changed is this yellow. And this is the people who, when they ask them, what are you? Are you Presbyterian? Are you Buddhist? Are you Methodist? They say, I'm really nothing in particular. I just don't even think about it. You've heard these people described as the nuns. And as we looked at last time, these nuns aren't necessarily atheist. A lot of them actually have pretty deep spiritual views, but the way they express those views is in a really kind of hodgepodge way. And we looked at the work of Terry Isabel Burton, who wrote a book called Strange Rites, New Religions for a Godless World. And what she discovered in her research is that this group of nuns, which is enormous, it's 30% of the American population, 100 million people that say, I'm just nothing in particular. They're very spiritual, but they tend to create these sort of bespoke religions where they mix a lot of things together. She says today's religiously remixed reject authority, institution, creed, and moral universalism. What they value is intuition, personal feeling, and experiences. And we looked at some evidence of that when we looked at like Soul Cycle and sort of the Wiccan movement and some of these kind of New Age places where people are expressing their faith. Also politics. Politics has become a very powerful way that people express their longing for God. Now, I think it's really important to point out this part, that they reject institutions. That is a huge deal. And it's a little bit worrying, but if you look at when Americans are polled, this is going all the way back to the late 70s, do you have confidence in these institutions, in these American institutions that kind of hold our society together? Basically, every single institution, people have lost trust in that. So we've got banks, Congress, education, the executive branch, major companies, medicine, et cetera, et cetera. The only institution that has done well is the military. Now, you might say, okay, well, the solution then is just to have a kind of church that is not attached to an institution. And that, of course, is the rise of non-denominational churches. And these certainly fill, I think, a certain need in America, and they have absolutely grown in popularity. If you look in the 1970s, it was almost a non-factor, non-denominational churches, and now it makes up 15% of Christians in America attend a non-denominational church. That might be a solution, but this is a Presbyterian church. So I'm going to be arguing today for the value of institutions. That institutions serve a really important role. They provide social order. They are a stable way that wisdom gets passed from generation to generation. One thing I've noticed is that at non-denominational churches, sometimes there's this idea that everything in between Jesus and us is not important. So you have Jesus in the first century, and then you have us, and you can just sort of snip the rest of the timeline and just bring you right to Jesus. Forgetting that 2,000 years of tradition and received sort of, this institutional wisdom that got passed on, I would argue that that information is really helpful and important, and we can learn a lot from the way that Christianity has evolved over the years. So this is actually probably even more worrying. It's not just institutions that people have lost trust in. We've lost trust in one another. This graph measures the percentage of people who say, if you walk out in the world, most people you meet on the street can be trusted. Well, in the 1960s, the number was over 55%. Now we are way down, closer to 30%. So there's a lot of implications of that. But certainly, if you're asking people to come to church and to trust what you're telling them, people are very suspicious and very kind of cautious about what they will give their allegiance to these days. So I want to kind of raise a question, because my sense is that where the new atheists failed is that they thought that if everybody would just become an atheist, we would have a utopian world. And it's a view that John Lennon expressed in his song Imagine, which really is about an atheist utopia. Can you imagine if there's no heaven? I mean, it's easy if you try. There's no hell below us, above us. It's just a sky. There's no heaven up there. It's just a sky. Imagine and so this is what he thinks it would lead to. If you got rid of religion, no possessions. There'd be no greed or hunger. If you got rid of religion, we'd have a brotherhood of man. No countries, get rid of borders. It isn't hard to imagine that. We'd have nothing to kill or die for if we just got rid of religion, right? Imagine all the people living life in peace. Here's the problem. We have gotten rid of religion to a degree. That's what we talked about last class. The rates of institutional religion have dropped enormously. You would think we would be a lot closer to this utopia. Would anyone wager to bet that we are closer to this utopian vision than we were in the 1980s when he sang the song? Anybody? Are we closer to this utopian vision? What do you think? The same? Farther away? We might be that's interesting, farther away, actually. So as religion has been on the decline, we may be in a worse society than we were before. And in fact, a lot of research says that's exactly where we are. There was a study put out 2 years ago by Biden's Surgeon General. It's a fascinating study. Usually the Surgeon General looks at very kind of cold, hard physical medical issues. This was a study on loneliness and isolation as a health problem. In this study, they looked at the dramatic increase in social isolation that Americans have gone through. So if you look from just in the last 20 years, our isolation has increased 24 hours per month. Our engagement with friends has decreased 20 hours per month, and our social engagement with others has decreased 10 hours per month. So what might the solution to that be? Well, this study suggests that maybe churches, believe it or not, could be an antidote to this. It says religious or faith-based groups can be a source for regular social contact. They can serve as a community of support. They can provide meaning and purpose. They can create a sense of belonging around shared values and beliefs. And they are associated with reduced risk-taking behaviors. What do we think about that? Does that make sense, or is that surprising? I mean, again, I think what I want to do is counter. I think there's an idea that churches are where people go to get radicalized. They're where people go to kind of take on these beliefs that would put them at odds with other Americans. Actually, research says precisely the opposite. This was an Atlantic article from 2 years ago. Though churches have a reputation in some circles as promoting hyper-politicization, they can be depolarizing institutions. Being part of a religious community often forces people to get along with others, including others with different political views, and it may channel people's efforts into charitable work or forms of community outreach that have little to do with politics. Leaving the community removes these moderating forces, opening the door to extremism. So this article, what happens when people stop going to church? When people leave the church, this article suggests that's when they become radicalized and extreme. What do we think about that? I mean, is there any personal anecdotal information that we have that might either support or challenge that? Do you think that going to church, I mean, here at Old Pine, we make a pretty conscious, concerted effort to say to people, this is a purple church. We want viewpoint diversity. We want to gather around truths that go beyond politics. So I know that there's a spectrum of beliefs here. Do you feel like this is a place where you can come and put that aside and get to know people as another human being, another brother and sister of Christ? Kathy?
Well, separate from politics, when I started going to church with my teenage children, one of the things I noticed was it was intergenerational.
It was intergenerational, yeah.
My children didn't have any grandparents that lived close to us. Yeah. So I found them telling people 2 generations older than themselves about winning a medal at their wrestling match the day before. Yeah. It was wonderful.
I think this is a hugely important point.
And I realized how segregated we are by age.
Yes, yeah. And also because this is not like sophisticated. This is like, I saw somebody and I heard about something that happened, they graduated high school, or we're not talking about like earth-shattering things. We're talking about simple human connections. Knowing what's going on in other people's lives has a depolarizing effect. The other thing about intergenerational, what I have seen is that, and this is, I think, really where we are doing a really good job here at Old Pine, you tend to have 2 extremes. In a lot of the institutional churches, they're graying, which means everybody's over 70, and it's very worrying because if you're not bringing in young people, it's going to be hard to sustain the church. On the other extreme, you have these like urban non-denominational churches where you can't find anybody over 30 in the whole church. Both of those, I think, miss what you're talking about, which is you can bring a child, they can get to know people at all stages of life, you have these mentoring relationships. It really is kind of like a town hall. Great point. Any other comments before we move on? Yeah.
Similar one. Maybe, I think, outside of a church community, people find themselves often within the same economic class or career. Yeah. Whereas at a church, you can find someone who, I work technology, but I can find someone who works in social work or in medicine that I may not find as easily.
That's a great point. I actually hadn't thought about that. So it's not just diversity of age or kind of these other categories of diversity. It's that maybe if you work in a field, you tend to congregate with people in that field and you don't meet people from these other walks of life. It's a great point. Okay, so here's the good news. Are we ready? The good news is that after 50 years of steady, hopeless decline, the statistics have actually shifted. It's remarkable, and nobody knows exactly why. We're going to talk about maybe why today. But if you look at the COVID years, right, 2020, oddly, the decline of people identifying as Christian in America stabilized. And because it has stabilized for several years, we can trust this information. This is not just like a fluke in one report. It has either leveled out and stopped declining, or it actually has ticked up a little bit. And that's really what the rest of this talk is going to be about, are all of these signs that there's a very surprising interest among a lot of people who maybe didn't really care about religion a few years ago. The other thing that's so interesting about it is there has been a shift in gender. So since time immemorial, I think probably since Jesus, women went to church more than men. Don't we know this? Everywhere you go, there are more women than men. It's the women who are doing all the work of the church. Oddly, this is by birth year. For people who were born in the early 80s and who are now young adults worshiping, there are more men than women going to church. It's absolutely remarkable. Nobody knows exactly why, but I've seen lately there have been kind of the reverse of what you saw 30 years ago. Now I'm seeing a push to bring more women back to church because they're actually starting to be underrepresented in some communities. Has anybody noticed that, or is that surprising to anybody? Not only in America, but so this is the UK. This is really remarkable because Europe secularized sooner than we did and more intensely than we did. And there are a lot of historical reasons for that. They kind of kicked out all the religious folks and they came here to be able to practice their religion. You know, a lot of them came to Pennsylvania because this was a place where people could practice their religion. And so Europe really lost its religious core faster than America did. And so this is really surprising. But if you look this is between 2018 and 2024, there has been an increase in young people going to church. It's quadrupled. 25 to 34, it's risen by over 300%, and you can see the rest of the results. There are a couple of demographics. Middle-aged folks have continued to drop a little bit, but what's so remarkable is that these younger generations are expressing a real desire to do these traditional things like go to church. It's sort of taken everybody by surprise. And I just a few headlines to show you that there are people who are talking about it. Gen Z is finding a religion. Why? Gen Z is rebelling by getting religion. Here's an article, The New Bible Boom, Why Gen Z is Buying More Bibles Than Ever. This is an interesting one. This looks at Google searches. What information are people trying to find on Google? And it shows that the words the Bible and Christianity as Google searches has skyrocketed beginning during COVID-19. It's quite remarkable and unexpected. So I want to bring this back now to a concrete example. So Lauren Jackson is a great reporter for the New York Times. I'm surprised by how good the New York Times' religion reporting is. You know, you think of it as kind of a very sort of secular newspaper, but they've got some excellent religion reporters. And one of my favorites is Lauren Jackson. And she, a few years ago, initiated a project called the Believe Project because she was sensing that there's a spiritual hunger in America that seems to be, a lot of people are feeling it right now. They're sort of disenchanted maybe with the secularization, and they're expressing some desire for something more. So she started to do these studies, a lot of polls online, trying to talk to different kinds of communities. She had one of the articles that I highly recommend. You could write this down and look it up. It's a wonderful article. But she sort of summarizes a lot of her findings in this article where she says, Americans haven't found a satisfying alternative to religion. Is it any wonder the country is revisiting faith? And in this article, she also talks about her own life. And that's one reason why the article is so powerful is she grew up in a very tight-knit Mormon community in rural Arkansas. And she talks about how it was all-consuming. It made sense. She says, in that small chapel by a freeway in Arkansas, I knew the potency of really believing that I had a certain place in the cosmos, that I was eternally loved, that life made sense. Now that reminds me of what Charles Taylor says we've lost, a sense that the universe makes sense. With all the problems in the Middle Ages, which there were many, poverty, disease, war, I don't think a lot of people went around saying, I don't know what my meaning is in life. That came later. We talked about the fact that the medieval cosmos, again, for all of the difficulties of the Middle Ages, people sensed that they were in an enchanted world of order, harmony, purpose, and meaning. You remember we talked last time about how the cathedral's architecture embodied that order. So you walked into the cathedral, and everywhere you looked, you were seeing a microcosm, in miniature, a sense of order that you also saw out there in the stars. So Lauren Jackson says that she left home, and like so many people, she went to college, and you start to question things, and maybe you just drift away from faith. When she got out on her own in her 20s, she started to try some things. She said, I spent my 20s worshiping at the altar of work, and in my free time, testing secular ideas for how to live well. I built a community. I volunteered. I cared for my nieces and nephews. I pursued wellness. Remember we talked about like Soul Cycle and all these kind of wellness communities? I paid for workout classes on Sunday mornings. I practiced mindfulness. I went to therapy. I visited saunas. I subscribed to meditation apps. I tried book clubs and running clubs. I cobbled together moral instruction from books on philosophy and whatever happened to move me on Instagram. But then she concludes, nothing has felt quite like that chapel in Arkansas. What do we think about that? Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that the subtext of them is to be the answer. The mindfulness, the yoga, the workout, the temple of work that she mentions. But if you're really looking for an answer, in my experience, I've found that it's not there. It's not there, and I'm looking for that chapel in Arkansas.
That's so powerful, because you would think a lot of people would look at this and they would see deprivation. It's a tiny little chapel. There's not a lot of people there. Maybe they're not well educated. It's in the middle of nowhere. And yet you're saying maybe this has something that our sophisticated urban experience doesn't necessarily provide. Does anybody else relate to that? Or simplicity? Yeah.
There's something about a little church like that. My dad used to be an interim pastor during the summer in little towns around where we lived. We worshiped in a huge cathedral-type Presbyterian church. So in the summertime, going to these little churches where there'd be few people and the organist maybe could play and maybe couldn't, and there'd be 3 people in the choir. I learned.
I can tell how moved you are by that. Doesn't that take us back to the importance of community? What's going on in other people's lives?
Yeah, it was simple and beautiful.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Kathy.
After 9/11, all I wanted was to go to church.
After 9/11,
I wanted to go to an institution that had history and values and something that was standing still in a way after 9/11.
What I hear there, and what I kind of am taking from Lauren Jackson as well, really is this idea of a unified understanding of the world. Because what she's actually saying is, she tried to cobble together a story. I'm going to take a little bit of this, a little bit of that, book club, yoga, and you can kind of create your own bespoke religion. Remember, like Tara Isabel Burton said. The problem is, does it really hang together? And are you connected? Is it moving you outside yourself, or is it really kind of a prison of the ego where it's just really yourself? It's just sort of self-referential. Yeah, Allison.
Oh, I think it's that and. Like, all these things, the work, the mindfulness, the meditation, like there's even the workouts, like you're looking for an achievement, you're looking for that thing. It's not always satisfying, but it's always like, what's the thing? What's the win? What have I accomplished? In here, and not just in this building, but definitely, in church, it's the place where just being open to asking the question is enough. And everyone else is in the same place. We don't all have the same questions, but you don't have to walk out of here every Sunday completely satisfied. But just being open to, there's a question and a what if. I think it's just a different plane of this is enough.
That's so powerful. What I'm hearing is you don't have to perform. Sometimes I joke that the church, we're kind of like, this is the place where you come when you can't do something. You know what I mean? Like most communities, like, if you're going to join a soccer league, there's probably some presumption that you're a decent soccer player, right? And if you're not a decent soccer player, they're probably not going to want you to play very much. This is where we come, where we say, I can't do it. I've tried, and I can't find what I need by myself. And other people say, I can't either. And somehow in that sharing of failure, we actually find our strength in Christ. Okay, so let's move on. Do you remember this slide? Anybody who was here the first lecture? So a supernova is what happened when a star explodes. And is what happens when a star explodes. And what it does is it shoots a trillion particles out in the universe. And if you remember, this is what Charles Taylor says is our current spiritual reality. That it's not that we've moved from, we used to believe in God, now we don't believe in God. It's that there are literally a million options. There used to be basically one story. It was the Christian story, or I guess if you moved to another country, you had another story. Now there are as many stories as there are people. And you can find a little bit of truth here and there and there, and you kind of try to create your own story. That is life in the supernova. And I think this is what church leaders maybe don't know right now, but they should know. That when you have people coming in off the street, and I hear it all the time, the kinds of stories they tell are the stories that Lauren Jackson tells. Can you tell me a coherent story that kind of makes sense of everything else? And I'm happy to say I can, not because it's my story, but because it's the Christian story. And C.S. Lewis put it so beautifully. He said, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And so this is the story of stories that makes sense, that creates that enchanted cosmos that we seem to really long for. So, I am bullish on the future of the church. I want to say that as well, because I think that we have such a compelling story. I also think it's true, by the way. And I want to show you some evidence that it's not only Christians who are noticing the power of the Bible's story. It's unexpectedly, it's a lot of secular people who are beginning to think, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't have thrown out the baby with the bathwater. So I'm going to go through and share some of those stories with you. This is a guy named Michael Shermer, who is a big skeptic. He has a podcast. I actually quite like him. He's very smart. And he says, what in the world is happening to secularists all of a sudden finding God? Here are just 4 recent titles sent to me by my publisher for the authors to be on my show. They sent him 4 books, all by secular people who are suddenly saying, maybe there's something to Christianity. This is just September 8th. That's just last week. The first is Jordan Peterson. Let me also say I'm not endorsing the views of any of the people I mentioned here. I'm sharing these stories with you because they are evidence of a shift that seems to be happening in our culture. So I don't know that much about Jordan Peterson. I don't follow him. But as a cultural phenomenon, it's been fascinating because Jordan Peterson is this Canadian Jungian scholar, and you wouldn't think that would draw a crowd. Like he talks about philosophy, he talks about psychology, and yet he has become massively popular to the extent that this is an auditorium in Portland, Oregon, right? Not the center of religious faith, giving a lecture on the Bible. And again, he is not kind of an Orthodox Christian. I mean, I think he's, maybe on the fence. Maybe, he started to say he's interested in Christianity, but he is absolutely not sort of, trying to bring people into the church. He's just saying, I think there's something here that makes sense of life. And people are so hungry for it that they're turning out in the thousands to go see him. Here's Tom Holland. Has anybody read Tom Holland? I highly recommend Tom Holland. He is a British historian, very well respected. He's won lots of awards. And he started his career as an expert in Roman history. So he has a lot of books about the Roman Empire. And he has said that he left, he grew up in the Church of England, but he always thought it was boring because he kind of identified more with Pilate than with Jesus because Pilate was powerful. And so he ended up studying, all these great, powerful Roman generals and emperors. And that, there was such an appeal for him there. But then later in his life, he began to look at ethics and values. Like where do our sense of right and wrong in the West? We have, obviously, human rights is a big deal in the West. To extent it's what America was founded on. Where do these ideas come from that we should treat people with dignity, that women should have rights, that people of any race and background should have full inclusion into society? He said he started to read, when he would read Roman history, it seemed increasingly foreign to him because it did not embody those values. He would come across, some story about Caesar who would brag about the fact that he killed 1 million Gauls on his last campaign, and he brought another 1 million back to Rome as slaves. And he would begin to say, that actually doesn't resonate with my sense of right and wrong. So he decided to write a book on where do Western values actually come from. And he said, despite his atheism, it took him back to Christianity. And to this remarkable fact that in the cross, God subverted, really the story is that God subverted all of our previous sense of right and wrong, and God identified with the victim. That this was a new thing. That the reason why the Romans mocked Christianity is not because of the supernatural claims, because they thought people could become gods too. The reason the Romans rejected Christianity is because Jesus was crucified. How could you believe in a God who lost, who was such a loser that he's arrested and tortured by Romans? That's what they couldn't believe in, because it upended their belief that might makes right and that God is might. Now, I see by the looks on your faces, you're like, that doesn't seem so weird. Right, but it would have 2,000 years ago. But we've been, enculturated by 2,000 years of this story. Now, he tells this remarkable story. When he was researching this book, he was doing this documentary in Iraq. And if you remember, after the United States invaded Iraq, there were these skirmishes between the Kurds and ISIS. Do you remember ISIS was kind of taking power in certain areas of Iraq? And he said he was in an area that ISIS had just left. And there had been people who had been crucified by ISIS. And he walked into this space and he saw these bodies, and he said there was a smell about it. And it shook him to the core. And he suddenly realized how radical the Christian story is, that God would die on a cross. And so he has written this book. Again, I wouldn't necessarily even call him a Christian. I think, again, like Jordan Peterson, because of his research, he's sort of straddling the fence and maybe is going to church. But his big contribution is that he's written this book, which to a lot of people, absolutely upend. Everybody used to think Christianity is the oppressor. And what he has said, which is so remarkable, is he has said to secular humanists, the values by which you judge Christianity are Christian values. It's pretty interesting. Another British writer who's sort of taken on this idea that the Christian Revolution was, really dramatic in forming our modern sense of ethics is this feminist named Louise Perry. Again, brilliant, highly recommend her writing. She started out her career as a very kind of typical, she wrote for The Guardian, which, as you know, is kind of like the New York Times, sort of left-wing British publication. And she sort of, just accepted all of these sort of what she thought were kind of you had to believe these certain things about feminism. Usually they're deconstructing Christian ideas, in terms of marriage. The marriage is old-fashioned, let's not do that. Or, we need to be free with our bodies. Sex work is work. There should be no restrictions on that. Then she said she volunteered at a rape crisis center. And she said all of that it didn't make sense anymore. She saw how sex work is absolutely destroying the lives of so many poor women, and that the percentage of women who may benefit from it is so small. And it's such a luxury belief to think that, well, if we just had more prostitution, then we'd be empowering to women. Then she began to make connections based on Tom Holland's work, that these weird ideas that women should have equal rights seem to come from Christianity. I'm going to let her speak on this.
I really do think that feminism comes out of Christianity. Feminism is completely reliant on Christian moral principles. I mean, just the idea that women's vulnerability is not something to be despised, but is something to be protected, that is basically a fundamentally Christian idea. Is not something that, the Romans thought. The idea that, say, a slave woman's sexual violation is abhorrent. Again, that is an idea that comes with Christianity and was absolutely not by any means universally recognized in the ancient world, or indeed in very many other cultures. And I am extremely nervous about what full de-Christianization means, and I don't think enough people think about what it actually means, because I think so many secular progressives don't realize quite how deeply Christian their thinking is.
Does that make sense? Kind of, sort of? I mean, I think because she's in a secular world and she hears so much criticism of Christianity as the problem, not the solution, she's wondering, okay, if we really did go full bore and tried to strip away Christian assumptions from our lives, maybe you don't know what that would actually look like. Maybe we might go back to what it looked like for women in Roman times. she has a wonderful article that it makes that exact point. I can send it to anybody who's interested. It's called "We Are Repaganizing," and she talks about the fact that when archaeologists are digging in these sites of the Roman Empire, there's a particular piece of evidence that they'll find which will tell them that they have found a brothel. It's a pit of baby bones. If they find a pit of baby bones, they know, oh, this is where the brothel was. Because if a prostitute became pregnant and gave birth, they would immediately kill the child if it were a boy. If it were a girl, they would raise it as a prostitute. And she says, this is what it looks like when you remove these assumptions that say, which were very remarkable in the Roman world, that say, wait a minute, every human being has value and should not be abused. So that's sort of where she's coming from. The other person I want to talk about, Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Does anybody know Ayaan Hirsi Ali? Yeah, Daisy? You? Big fan. So Ayaan Hirsi Ali, fascinating figure. She grew up in Somalia and in a deeply Muslim community, and went through a lot of traumatic experiences, genital mutilation, where her own grandmother kind of participated in that. And at a certain point was able to get away and moved to the Netherlands. And because of her experience with a very fundamentalist kind of Islam, she dove into atheism. Because she's so brilliant, she became involved in politics. She was elected as a minister in a political minister in the Netherlands. And she joined the New Atheists. So she was kind of with Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, and she was sort of one of those figures who would go around, and they loved it because, they not only Christianity, but also Islam, or, they would criticize Islam as well. And she was right there with them. And it really solidified when, and the reason she left the Netherlands is she had a friend. It was actually it was a Van Gogh, like the great grandson or something of Vincent van Gogh. He was a public figure who had made a documentary critical of Islam, and he was killed in the street with a knife in his chest. And the note on the knife said, "She's next," because she had also spoken out about Islam. So she came to America for safety, really. And after a certain number of years, she went through a very personal crisis where she had a lot of depression, a lot of alcoholism. And she found herself being led to faith in a way that she never could have expected. And I think here she talks a little bit about that. Can you hit the space bar, Priscilla? See if that plays? Just the space bar on bottom? Yeah.
My experience is my awakening, spiritual awakening, was preceded by suffering, depression, just really mental agony. And that's unfortunately what led me to my spiritual awakening. But maybe what led me to the mental depression was the shutting off of spirituality and the declaration that I'm an atheist, I can do all things by myself.
So she has gone from thinking religion is a negative force that really hurts people to saying maybe it was my atheism that caused my depression because I was cutting myself off from spirituality. That's a remarkable shift. Now, what happened to her friendships with the New Atheist when she came out publicly, right? That's what we're going to talk about next. She was brave enough to decide to agree to come on stage with Richard Dawkins, her old buddy, and allow him to talk to her about her newfound faith. He didn't believe it at first. He thought maybe she was just kind of faking it. Play this. We'll look at their conversation.
That's a moving personal story, but to call herself a Christian is a bit different. I mean, a Christian has to believe in something. And, you go to church now, and you listen to the vicar, and do you kind of notice what a lot of nonsense he talks? I mean, do you really take it seriously that Jesus is the Son of God, Jesus rose from the dead, Jesus was born of a virgin, and that's part of Christianity?
So I think because you, and I know you very well, we've been friends for a long time, and in fact, in some ways, I think of you as a mentor. I would say you're coming at this from a place of there is nothing. And what has happened to me is I think I have accepted there is something. And when you accept that there is something and there is a powerful entity, for me, the God that turned me around, I think what the vicar is saying no longer sounds nonsensical. It makes a great deal of sense. I think I've come down to my knees to say, perhaps those people who've always had faith have something that we who lost faith don't have.
Thoughts about that? It's a pretty good answer to somebody who's very mocking and condescending in his question. I mean, I think showed a lot of humility. Any thoughts about that? Or, I mean, I'm sure these are questions that if other people haven't asked you, you've asked yourself. What a lot of nonsense Jason is talking on Sunday morning. Do you really believe all that stuff? Right? I mean, I think this last thing, maybe these people who have come before us know something that we don't, or maybe they have something that we need but don't think that we need, is very powerful. So, okay, so this conversation continues, and I want to say, to an extent, Rich, I appreciate Richard Dawkins. In the next clip, he acknowledges that if God were real, I mean, of course he doesn't believe he is, but if he were, boy, that actually would be incredible. Please play. Oh, actually, let me go forward. All right, now play.
You appear to be a theist. You appear to believe in some kind of higher power. Now, I think that the hypothesis of theism is the most exciting scientific hypothesis you could possibly hold. And the idea that the universe was actually created by a supernatural intelligence is a dramatic, important idea. If it were true, it would completely change everything we know.
Okay, so I think that's actually interesting. And what I wanted to do is use that as a way to transition to the last part of this talk. So we've looked so far at Jordan Peterson, who I think has exposed that there's a real meaning crisis in our culture, that people long for meaning. We've looked at Tom Holland and Louise Perry, who show that people are beginning to connect our modern sense of morality and ethics to these Christian roots. And then we looked at Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who's talked about how opening to God can be personally transformative. He is now letting us go into the final area that I want to talk to you about, and I think it actually might be the most exciting, and it's what churches, I think, need to be talking about, which is the fact that science also, I think, makes sense of Christianity and supports Christianity. And that might be, at first blush, an idea that seems strange to you, because again, the common message is, well, as soon as you have a brain and understand things like evolution, you can't believe in God anymore, right? Science fundamentally contradicts faith, right? Tell that to ancient, or not even ancient, the scientists who created the scientific revolution. Copernicus, who could live in close contact with the most consummate order and divine wisdom and not feel drawn to the loftiest aspirations? Who could not adore the architect of all these things? These next few slides, these are literally the most brilliant scientists in Europe who created the scientific revolution. Kepler, he was the one who first figured out the orbit of the planets, that they were elliptical, they weren't circular, as Aristotle had suggested. He says, I was merely thinking God's thoughts after him. And then Newton, who a lot of people regard as probably the greatest scientist who ever lived. That's what Einstein said. So brilliant, it's hard to even talk about how brilliant he was. He was so prolific, and what most people don't know is he actually wrote as much theology as he wrote science. He said this most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. This being governs all things, not as the soul of the world, but as Lord over all. So what Newton was trying to figure out, he described how gravity works. And he did it so well that actually we put a man on the moon based on Newton's calculations. That's how brilliant he was. But he didn't know what gravity was. He could describe it. He could calculate how it works. He could not describe what gravity is. We still don't know what gravity is. Ask a physicist what gravity is. We don't know. Ask a physicist what energy is. We don't know. Richard Feynman, who's one of the most brilliant physicists, won the Nobel Prize. We have no knowledge of what energy is. Okay? There are deep, deep mysteries to this universe. And I think a lot of these mysteries, again, everything is probability. I'm not going to prove to you today that God exists. My point in sharing this with you is that when you look at this information and you say, what is the more probable answer? Is the more probable answer there is no God or that there is an intelligence behind the universe? I've come down on the side of it's probably more likely that these mysteries point to an intelligent. So that will put us at odds, however, with Richard Dawkins. So coming from a materialist point of view, he says, the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. Now, I appreciate this actually because he at least has the courage to admit where materialism takes you. So if you're intellectually honest and you say the only thing that's real is atoms, that's the only thing that exists, there's no supernatural realm, material world is all there is. It has to take you in this direction. You might believe that there's morality within a culture, but it's just within that culture. There's no ultimate sense in which there is a right or wrong. Does that make sense? Right? I mean, we've evolved to say that, like, for example, this is a story that this British journalist tells, that he once talked to Richard Dawkins after a lecture, and he challenged him on this point. He said, okay, do you think rape is wrong? And Dawkins, of course, said, of course rape is wrong. And he said, no, I mean ultimately wrong. And he said, well, I think it's wrong in our culture. And he said, no. He said, we've evolved to think rape is wrong, but is that as arbitrary as we have 5 fingers, we could have had 6? And Dawkins says, well, I guess you could say that. So in other words, you could say that rape is wrong within our society because we've evolved with a certain moral structure, but you can never say we could just as easily exist in some other society in which that was a good thing. There's no ultimate sense of right and wrong. That's where materialism, if you're intellectually honest, has to take you. But there is increasingly a movement to challenge that. And again, this is another hopeful sign. This is Stephen Meyer, who I think, Daisy, you went to Biola, right? So he's, I'm pretty sure, at the Discovery Institute. Is that part of Biola, or? It's a wing of Biola, okay. Stephen Meyer, and I certainly recommend his book to you, he's a very careful scientist. He's also a man of faith, and he has said that there are 3 discoveries in the 20th century that now that they're kind of established are making people think, again, the probability, there's no certainty, but the probability is that there seems to be an intelligent supernatural mind behind reality. The first is the Big Bang. Some people are surprised to know that the Big Bang is a pretty new discovery. It really was only recognized in the 1930s. Everybody before the 1930s thought that the universe was eternal and static. It was not expanding, it was the same size, it had always been the same size, and that was really helpful if you were a physicist, because if you're doing calculations, it's a lot easier to have a universe that stays exactly still to do calculation. If it's moving, that adds this other kind of variable. But then we started to develop these really great telescopes, and like Hubble, for example, who was in California, looked out and he saw these redshifts, which only appear if a star is moving away from you. I said, well, that's weird. These stars seem to be moving away from us. If that's the case, maybe at one point they were closer together. And the guy who really put all the pieces together was actually a Jesuit priest. The Jesuits have always been involved in science, named George Lemaitre. And Einstein didn't want to believe it at first. But eventually he actually went to California, he looked through the telescope, and when he later met George Lemaitre, he said, this entire deal resembles too much the book of Genesis. We can see that you are a priest. And this is why. If the universe has always existed, then Genesis can't be right. Because Genesis says the universe had a beginning. The Big Bang says the universe had a beginning. So that's discovery number one. The second one is a discovery of fine tuning. And this is really remarkable, and instead of trying to explain it, I'm going to let this video do the talking. Priscilla, please.
From galaxies and stars, down to atoms and subatomic particles, the very structure of our universe is determined by these numbers. These are the fundamental constants and quantities of the universe. Scientists have come to the shocking realization that each of these numbers has been carefully dialed to an astonishingly precise value, a value that falls within an exceedingly narrow, life-permitting range. If any one of these numbers were altered by even a hair's breadth, no physical, interactive life of any kind could exist anywhere. There'd be no stars, no life, no planets, no chemistry. Consider gravity, for example. The force of gravity is determined by the gravitational constant. If this constant varied by just 1 in 10 to the 60th parts, none of us would exist. To understand how exceedingly narrow this life-permitting range is, imagine a dial divided into 10 to the 60th increments. To get a handle on how many tiny points on the dial this is, compare it to the number of cells in your body, or the number of seconds that have ticked by since time began. If the gravitational constant had been out of tune by just one of these infinitesimally small increments, the universe would either have expanded and thinned out so rapidly that no stars could form and life couldn't exist, or it would have collapsed back on itself with the same result: no stars, no planets, and no life. Or consider the expansion rate of the universe. This is driven by the cosmological constant. A change in its value by a mere 1 part in 10 to the 120th parts would cause the universe to expand too rapidly or too slowly. In either case, the universe would again be life-prohibiting. Or another example of fine-tuning. If the mass and energy of the early universe were not evenly distributed to an incomprehensible precision of 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd, the universe would be hostile to life of any kind. The fact is, our universe permits physical, interactive life only because these, and many other numbers, have been independently and exquisitely balanced on a razor's edge. Wherever physicists look, they see examples of fine-tuning. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. If anyone claims not to be surprised by the special features that the universe has, he's hiding his head in the sand. These special features are surprising and unlikely.
So the question to ask, so if you accept that the fine-tuning is a reality, the real question is, because again, we have two choices. Was that an accident? Does that make sense? Was it an accident that these infinitesimal values were achieved? Right? If it was an accident, we just got really lucky. Holy cow. I mean, the needle in a haystack doesn't even start to begin to explain it. It is so vanishingly unlikely that life would be possible. So that's one option. We just got lucky. And what a lot of atheist scientists will say is they'll begin to invoke the multiverse. Because they can't dispute this information. It is so exceedingly unlikely that this universe would produce life, but they'll say, well, there are an infinite number of universes. We happen to wind up in the one where life was possible. So you have to decide, is that a better explanation, or would a better explanation be there's an intelligence behind the universe, and we were meant to be here? That would be the theistic answer. Okay, one more, and I know you guys are getting tired. I appreciate you hanging in. Let me just, really quickly, so Paul Davies, again, not a religious man, he says, scientists are slowly waking up to an inconvenient truth. The universe looks suspiciously like a fix. For 40 years, physicists and cosmologists have been quietly collecting examples of all too convenient coincidences and special features in the underlying laws of the universe that seem to be necessary in order for life and hence conscious beings to exist. Okay, so that's insight number 2, discovery number 2. The third one has to do with DNA. This is another very recent discovery. Francis Crick and James Watson discovered that first, that our DNA has a particular shape, a helical shape, and then they discovered that if you look into our DNA, it's made up of strands of information, letters. This is language. This is an instruction book in the cell of every single one of our cells that explains to our bodies how to create us. And all living beings have this language. The question is it an accident? Because now we're talking about semiotics. And usually when you come across language, it suggests a mind. So if you were walking along the beach and you looked down and there was a sign that said, help. Again, you'd have two choices. That is an accident. It's a random product of the universe, that things happen to fall in such a way that there was this shape that I recognize as saying help, but it doesn't mean anything. Or somebody with a mind wrote that. Those are your two choices. Let John Lennox explain. He's another scientist.
The human genome, the DNA molecule, is an information-bearing molecule. Look up there. EXIT. You see 4 letters. You know that has a meaning. And you will deduce immediately that whatever physical processes went into producing that, there's a mind behind it. And yet, some of my colleagues can look at the DNA molecule with the word 3.4 billion letters long and say it was chance and the laws of nature. You know, I said to them, tell me the origin of what you do science with, your brain or your mind. And they say, well, the brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And I smile at them and I say, and you trust it? Tell me honestly, if you knew that your computer that you're going to use tomorrow in your lab was the end product of an unguided, mindless process, would you trust it? And from every scientist I've asked that question, with hesitation, I've had the answer, no, I would not. And I said, I see you have a problem.
Does that make sense? Another way of thinking about it would be, and this is kind of a classic hypothesis or experiment, you put 10 monkeys in a room with 10 typewriters, and you come back in 1 billion years. Do you think that they would have produced Hamlet?
You believe what?
That they would have produced Hamlet?
No.
Because if in the materialist version, it's just accidental. He's saying, if that is the case, how do you even trust your mind? If the mind is a product of just an accidental, evolution has no purpose, it has no goal, its goal is not truth. We're just here for survival. Can you then trust that mind to understand the secrets of the universe or theology or poetry or anything else? Does that make sense? Okay, 2 more slides. I know you guys are tired. My goal today has been to say that maybe the universe really is like this. And I think these scientific insights and all these insights from these other thinkers suggest that maybe we actually don't live in a disenchanted world. Maybe the world still is enchanted. And 2 more things. So I was dropping my daughter off at camp earlier this summer, and we actually got to go over and see one of Robert Frost's former home, and we were walking the same woods that he had walked, which was very special. And I was reminded of this poem, Birches, in which he invokes the cosmos, the medieval cosmos, where they believed that there was a glass ceiling above the world. He said, soon the sun's... by the way, he's describing what happens when in the winter it gets really cold overnight, but then as the sun comes out, those ice crystals start to melt and fall. He says, soon the sun's warmth makes them shed crystal shells, shattering and avalanching on the snow crust, such heaps of broken glass to sweep away, you'd think the inner dome of heaven had fallen. Now, Robert Frost doesn't believe that there's glass up in the sky. Why would he invoke a medieval picture of the cosmos? Does it speak to you when he uses that metaphor? Is there a longing in you to think of the world as ordered and harmonious? Last one, Malcolm Guite, who's a great poet from the UK. In a sense, we're not re-enchanting the world. What we're doing is disenchanting ourselves. The world is still as enchanted as ever it was. It's still kindling with beauty, but we have eyes that see not, ears that hear not, and hearts that neither feel nor understand. Thank you.